the unboundaried life looks like heaven, but is hell. Unfortunately, we are killing ourselves as a species in a spiritual way, but also in a very literal, physical way.
Where this is going, as you said, this is leading to catastrophe.
Mark, words of violence.
But my testosterone is exceptionally high.
So this is where the hippies are right. The hippies aren't totally wrong.
Modern psychology and psychiatry is driving us mad.
Problem is, every conspiracy I think is not true turns out to be true eventually, right? Hell isn't hot, hell is grey, and he represents it.
As Guy always says, flattery will get you everywhere.
Thank God someone's telling the truth. It's refreshing. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Once you've got controlled language and got people to say something they don't believe in, then you've won.
Mark Walsh, thank you very much for joining us at the Custom and Reason podcast. It's great having you.
Pleasure.
Now, Mark, we're just going to get stuck into it because we don't wait here. I've had this feeling for a while, and I'm wondering what you're thinking, which is that modern psychology and psychiatry is driving us mad.
Yeah, we live in the psychological apocalypse. So we live in sort of the best time to be alive materially. You know, we have EasyJet, cappuccino, and cheap flights to Warsaw and all the rest of it. But we also live in a time where most people are being driven more or less insane. It's normal now to be addicted to something, even if it's just your phone. There's something we could call the meaning crisis, where people feel generally lost in, and this has been going on really since the 16th century, but it's massively accelerated recently due to technology, due to woke, due to various other factors we can break down. And that means everybody's mental. And the problem is the psychologists are mostly liberal, so they're mental too. So unfortunately, I'm going to use non-technical terms like mental. The psychologists who are supposed to be helping us are in many cases worse. So that's the situation we're in today.
I wonder what your personal journey is. Was there ever a wokey kind of cuddly empathy above all else, Mark Walsh? Can we find him in the internet?
Can you delete expletives from this? No, I mean, I grew up in a relatively liberal family who didn't have as much boundaries as I would now say is healthy. You know, I grew up alcoholic by the time I was a teenager, suicidal. Multiple members of my family had mental health problems. And I just thought, hang on a minute, like everyone's crazy. What's going on? I need to find some way to deal with this. And then my journey started, I guess, with martial arts. I was like, okay, discipline and masculine order, and like I had you know, good male role models, and that really helped me as a teenager. And then I, you know, went into Buddhism, eventually came home to Catholicism, and you know, I've been on a full journey through it. A lot of trauma work. I started a charity in Ukraine working with trauma. I've dedicated my whole life to studying the ways to stay sane, and I've pressure tested that in the most extreme situations. And now it seems like everybody, like, you know, how hipsters are into bands before they were cool. You know, I was into like helping people not get mentally ill before it was necessary for everyone. So, yeah, that's my journey.
All right. I love that condensed version. I'm wondering if we can maybe unpack this idea around talking about your feelings, because for a long time, and now let's also remember, a lot of people get their mental health knowledge through social media, TikTok, etc. For a long time, it's just been the absolute thing that you must share your feelings. You must talk about your feelings. And when someone does it, you should listen to them.
Gay. Yeah, no, I don't think we should all the time. So, I mean, I'm being a little silly, but how can I put this? Particularly around men's mental health, people say men should just talk more about their feelings. So, well, hang on, what are men sharing about? They're sharing about the facts that their life is rubbish, and they're upset that their life is rubbish. I would suggest better for men to make their lives not rubbish. I mean, sharing your feelings could be on the list of things to do. If you were to give me like, you know, top 10 things to do for mental health, I'd say, you know, spend more time in nature, exercise, pray, meditate, get a good social circle, do some kind of a movement practice, all those things. Maybe ninth or 10th on the list would be maybe share to a therapist if you need to, have good friends you can share with. But for men, it's not top on their list. Much better to solve the problems men face around money, around dating, around status, around the world, rather than find a way to complain about your crap life. Better we help men have good lives.
So I'm wondering about psychology in general, right? Because there's a lot of complicated words in psychology. You know, the handbook for psychology is about yay big.
Yeah, sure.
You're making it sound too easy, mate.
It's actually really easy. The main problem I would say is that most psychologists have an insufficient anthropology. So they have an inadequate view of what a human being is. So the average psychologist comes from liberal modernity, or we could say materialist modernity. So the worst extreme of that is the wokies. But actually, just the average dude is also within that, the last few hundred years. And their view of human nature doesn't have a view of goodness, doesn't have a view of virtue, doesn't have a view of beauty, doesn't have a strong sense of tribe or community. In fact, since World War II, most psychologists have been absolutely found the idea of belonging and tribe toxic. We've been subject to a level of violation in Western Europe that is, I mean, traumatizing is an overused word, but in this case, I'd say it's true, in terms of being violated as a people. To me, it's relatively simple. We need to have four connections. I call this the tetrarchy model. So like this can be like a little audit if you're not doing great right now. You need to connect your body. In a technological world, that's an anchor of sanity. I went to the gym today. I always feel good afterwards. I did Aikido last week. I always feel good afterwards. It's basic. Second connection is you need tribe, you need community, not just one therapist who talks to you once a week for money. You need friends to go to the pub with. You need to, I know my neighbors. You need a great partner. You need an extended family to help with the kids. You need a church. You need a community. You need all those things. You need a nation, right? And then you can be world centric. If you've got all that, let's talk about being Catholic in the best sense, the universal sense, right? Like if you're actually got a sense of your own people, your own tribe. And then third connection you need is a connection to nature. So this is where the hippies are right. The hippies aren't totally wrong. I call this like eco-regulation. Like go into the woods, it's fun. Go hiking, go to the Lake District, whatever. Like that'll keep you way saner than doing therapy in a dark office once a week. And the last connection you need is to God, or we could also say purpose or spirit. This is the hardest one to name. And I believe that human beings just don't work without that connection, which is why no atheist society has lasted more than 100 years ever in human history. There's been attempts at it, from the Greeks onwards, but it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. We need some kind of God. And of course, 99.995% of your ancestors were Paleolithic, which means they absolutely had these things. They had a strong sense of the body. They had a strong sense of tribe. They had a strong sense of connection to the land, story, to history. We could say body, belonging, biome, and belief. So that's my basic model of sanity.
I definitely say a lot of that resonates with me because I've sorted out my diet. I started moving a lot more. I'm not such a fatty sort of donut puff, kind of like a composite of pho and pad
Good
thai.
man. Looking good. You're looking good.
I wasn't asking for a compliment, Mark,
Middle-aged English guy.
as
Yeah,
Guy always says, flattery will get you everywhere.
Anyway,
But I'm thinking, for example, about what forces were arranged to create the conditions in which all the things that you've been talking about today came together. Is it a dark force? Is it just happenstance? Where's that energy coming from?
It was the gingers. Let's blame the gingers. No, I would say you could look at it more or less conspiratorially. You could look at it as a sort of the problem is every conspiracy I think is not true turns out to be true eventually, right? So like I've become quite skeptical about people who are anti-conspiratorial. I keep having to apologize to my more conspiratorial friends. Certainly, we could view it as a technological advance through history. A movement, something called the machine. Paul Kingsnorth calls it, for example. And this is a movement towards the technological and also this sort of managerial. If you look at Starmer, for example, he sort of orgasms in black and white. He's like an accountant's orgasm, isn't he? It's just something just deadly managerial. Hell isn't hot, hell is gray, and he represents it. So that sort of movement towards the industrial, which C.S. Lewis, of course, identified the kind of Mordor industrial, and the managerial, the kind of Blairite, has happened throughout history. And we could just say it's a movement of history. I would say it doesn't mean we need to be victims of it. We can be conscious of it. You could call it satanic. I mean, it's a death cult. I mean, modernity is a death cult.
What do you mean by that?
So it's a cult and it's based around death. The satanic bit we could argue about if you're religious or not. So what do I mean? It is anti-life. Anti-life in the sense of like, the gray, like the office. It's something about that just isn't fully alive. But it's also in the very literal sense, we're not reproducing in the West. Whatever we're doing is stopping us reproducing. 1/3 of the babies who are conceived in the UK are murdered in the womb. Fact. Okay, old people increasingly, they're trying to kill old people across Western nations. I think it's 10% of deaths in Canada now through euthanasia. This is, Had its ups and downs in the UK too. Addiction always ends in death. I'm 19 years sober, so I have sympathy for addiction, but the modern world leads to a state of dysregulation physiologically. People then try and regulate that because we're not regulated. We're not co-regulated. We're not eco-regulated. We're not theo-regulated. So we're not regulated by those things, four things I mentioned before. And as a result, we try and self-regulate, and that ends up in addiction and death. It's just the way, dopamine works, is you need more and more of it. So unfortunately, we are killing ourselves as a species in a spiritual way, but also in a very literal, physical way. And I say it's a cult as well, because if you try and leave it, people get real upset. Like every cult has a cult leader, and in our current culture, the sort of cult leader is oneself in a way. It's very weird. It's like an auto cult. You're worshiping at your own self, like the iPhone, the ego phone, because there's nothing, there's no higher power, there's nothing bigger that you can give oneself to. Nation is destroyed, religion is destroyed, all those things are destroyed. All that leaves is oneself to worship, because we have to worship. That's a very human thing. We have to worship. Some people try and worship football teams or fandoms, Harry Potter or whatever. We have this urge. And when that's turned in on oneself, it's the satanic move to worship oneself, to make oneself God. That ends very, very badly for people. And that's what I've really spent my life studying. And you could look at this theologically, you could look at this more just in terms of technologically. I tend to work more on the psychological level, like I'm coaching people, I'm helping people in various ways psychologically. But that's just an access point. There are historians who can map this better than me, for example, on the more macro level. Does that make any
Well,
kind of sense?
absolutely. And it's interesting. You said at the beginning, this kind of started in the 16th century or documented in the 16th century. Uh, Maybe my history is not as good, but I see this more coming post World War II. Our grandparents, possibly great grandparents' generation, had to go through World War II, and I see this whole yearning for something to do as almost as a sign of success, filling the vacuum. Would you see any mileage in that idea?
Well, if you want to shit on the boomers, I'm down for that. We can play that game. But I mean, you could say it began with agriculture, the first split of those splits. You could say it began with the Reformation and then later the Renaissance. I think there's a valid case for that in terms of the sort of split from those four splits that I mentioned. I think previous to World War II, you had two important events. One was the 30 Years' War, which in the UK we don't know enough about, but it was really like a World War level event. But for the Germans, for example, like a third of the population was killed. I think it was absolute devastation, and that was a religious
Yeah.
war. On the surface, a religious war, but really it was the war of the sort of growing sense of self and nationhood. And then obviously World War One just destroyed a generation, and I think made us cynical and weak in Europe. The like I was teaching a workshop in Belgium not long ago, and I said, "Who would die for Belgium?" And people laughed out loud. I mean, obviously, it's a made-up country that the British invented, but
Sure.
the king of Belgium did fight in the trenches in World War One, right? And I
Yeah.
have Ukrainian friends who uncynically would die for Ukraine, right? But generally in Western Europe, Polish people who I think would give their lives for their country in Poland, I think. However, in the Western world, we've lost a reason to live and a reason to die. That the World War One, I think, created a cynicism around, hence Tolkien's vision of Mordor came out of the trenches, right? World War
Mm.
Two, I'm very much with Jennifer Peugeot on this. A lot of our current evils were defined by World War Two. You've probably heard of the post-World War II consensus, the idea that we defined who the bad guys were. And what the question no one wants to ask is, in what ways was Hitler a little bit maybe right? That's a very uncomfortable question, right? Hitler,
Yeah.
bad man, did bad things, the Germans, the Nazis more broadly. But for example, if we define any kind of masculine boundary as bad, because that's a more mild version of the more extreme hyper boundary nationalism, we then have a problem. It's like we threw the baby out with the bathwater. So, for example, the connection between land and people, the Nazi blood and soil version, not good. The sane version of nationhood, totally common sense through all of human history.
Yeah.
So we end up with the Guardian saying, the gym is far right and families are far right, and I don't know, like eating a steak is far right, because they haven't defined it. They haven't defined the far left, and everything. There's just been a sort of drift towards if evil is on this side, then it's just like we keep lowering the bar for what that evil is. And now that's hit a point which is ridiculous, which is why comedians are on the right now, not the left. Like it's so easy to make jokes about this stuff because the wokies they're mental, right? And it's low hanging fruit. I feel like it's child abuse making jokes about the wokies actually, because they're just so bizarrely immature. But we've also got to a point where it's leading to catastrophe. So, for example, the Germans, let's take the German example, not being able to have a sense of nationhood. And, I was recently in Germany and I got them singing their national anthem, and 50% of them couldn't do it. The younger ones are better, but the older ones, they just couldn't do it because they felt like it was too right wing. I mean, and they've even changed it to make it less right wing, the words. Now, Merkel has even admitted that mass migration to Germany was a mistake. But if you've got that open is good, liberal is good, we could say feminine, or if you want to make it a bit less controversial, yin, to use the sort of Chinese yin and yang, I think is less gendered. If we say yin is good, then eventually you get to the limits of that, and we don't realize why the masculine, the father, is necessary. Do I sound like complete lunatic, or is this making any kind of sense?
Well, I think we're
Guy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's an extraordinary place we've got to, and where's this going? As you said, this is leading to catastrophe. How do you see this evolving now?
I'm an optimist. So the good news is, because the people who are deepest in the death cult are not reproducing, all we have to do is eat steak and have babies and wait a generation and they're gone. Okay. So the religious people are having best sex, the most sex, and the most children. Facts, 3 facts for you there. Okay. I personally can attest to that with my Italian fiance. Okay. So what that means is we're just going to outbreed them because they're in a death cult and we're not. All right. That's number one.
Let's talk otherwise. Poland, where we're sitting right now, and Britain, similar. Women are having the fertility rate's about 1. So
that's average women, though. Mark's point is that people who go to church are having great times in bed when they get back home, or wherever.
Absolutely
they do.
True. And it's not true in Israel, for example. Israel's one of one of the only developed nations that has a above average replacement, even amongst the non-religious. So the religious in Israel have like 5 or 6 babies, okay, on average. But even the secular Jews in Tel Aviv, I've been there many times. They're very secular people in Tel Aviv, a lot of people. They're also above replacement because they still have a sense of purpose and nation. They have boundaries, and, that's there. So they're an interesting exception. There are others. And this is obviously multifactorial. I like Louise Perry's, if you know Louise Perry, she's very good. Her breakdown of this is excellent. And, you've got to look at, they are turning the frogs gay. Some of it is just the hormones in the water. Some of it is economic.
Is there anything in that? Hormones in the water, is that real?
I had Raw Egg Nationalist on my podcast, and he's much more expert than me on the hormone stuff. And as far as I can tell, I've just done a little bit of, like 10 hours of research on it. It's pretty terrifying. Like, it'll be enough to turn you organic. You'll be a hippie again. So it's definitely, there's something in the physiological. Like, I measure my testosterone regularly, and my testosterone is probably I had it measured just yesterday.
I'd
like to invite Guy to share his results from this morning.
I just had a full suite of blood tests. Yes, I got the results.
How's it going?
Everything's my iron's a bit low, so a bit more steak apparently.
Bit more steak,
but my testosterone is exceptionally high. So
excellent.
I haven't had it properly analyzed yet. I haven't
got the numbers at hand.
No, I have to look it up.
Got it this morning.
I haven't got the numbers. It's just high.
Well, there is a biology here, but I'm not an expert in the biology. What I would say, it's worth looking at, it's worth measuring. There are things I took advice on how to increase mine, and it has increased over time. And I think the figures are our testosterone now is about a quarter of what our grandparents was, which is when it was first measured. So it is actually a hormonal crisis. I'd recommend Charles Cornish, Raw Egg Nationalist. His work on this is excellent.
Mark, you're obviously not beating around the bush. How do people respond to this when you're working with them in groups or individuals? Talking about Britain, but also more widely.
2 main responses. One is to say, thank God someone's telling the truth. It's refreshing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay. And the other one is to cry and scream, and then they call me names, and then nothing bad happens. I mean, I am almost certainly going to get arrested at Heathrow at some point. I'm prepared for that. I get put in detention for a few weeks or whatever, I'll just do some meditating and it'll be fine. But mostly people's response is just to sort of stamp their feet. And I go, well, okay, they have a childish response, and I'm fine with that. Yeah. But honestly, most people are sane in the sense of there's 10% who are really ideologically possessed, and they have a lot of airtime on the BBC and Channel 4, and sadly in HR, in corporations, and certainly in schools and media. But and 10% of people are kind of, they've figured it out, right? So that they love it. But the other 80% are like, I think you're right. Like there's just mums who come to me and say, why are there, boys in the girls' changing rooms now? Why is this happening? Why is that happening? Why does my daughter want to cut her breasts off? Like just nice, normal, liberal mums who are like really getting it. So
Yeah.
I think the cultural tide has turned. I mean, people tried to cancel me 5 years ago, and now I think they'd struggle. And also, there's a price to be paid, but it's honestly, my granddad was fought in D-Day, right? Like, I don't take the risks he takes. My risk is people saying mean things about me on X. It doesn't.
But Mark, words are violence.
Yeah. I mean, that idea that words of violence means we can't have a discussion, right? I mean, the one thing the left has been very good at is redefining words. And I think those of us on the right have kind of caught up, and we've realized that if you call it Islamophobia, which is a psychological term, for example. So I think the left has been very, let's give them credit. And George Orwell saw this coming, who was on the
Yeah,
left.
right. Words out of
Um,
my mouth. Once you've got controlled language and got people to say something they don't believe in, then you've won, or words to that effect.
Well, there's
From
two
all.
things there. Once you control language, you control thought. The second one is if you
Yeah.
can make people say something ridiculous, there's something called cognitive dissonance in psychology. People feel like they're aligned. It's also demoralizing for people. And the tide has turned. Like the kids are more right, like a scarily right wing. Like a lot of young
Yeah.
guys who are always the people who start revolutions. Young women are massively radicalized left, and the studies show they're far more radicalized than young men. But there's a group of young men who are going to I meet them in the gym. They go to church. They're a small group, but they are the vanguard, as it were, in terms of social change, which is why mainstream
Yeah.
media shits on young men so badly, because they are the threat to the mainstream.
Yeah.
So the mainstream offers nothing to young men, particularly young white guys. It just tells them they're bad. They have like this original sin of their Western whiteness. And young men are like, okay, you're not offering me anything. You hate me. You're discriminating me against me in the workplace. You've destroyed the dating market with apps. You've destroyed the financial market. They're just like, fuck you. Okay. And they are smart, and they are well read, and they are well prayed, and they're well worked out. And I don't think we need to worry, because it's another way of looking at it. Like I'm quite hopeful, despite the apps. I mean, I've stared into the abyss in 6 different war zones, right? So I mean, I'm just happy to be living in a nice place. But aside from that, I'm hopeful because I talk to these guys, and the the conditions of late modernity are so bad that it's accidentally created a new breed of just like saintly warrior who like
Yeah.
I mean like let's take porn, right? I don't use porn. It's disgusting on a number of levels. But I could open up this phone and show you more naked women doing more decadent things than all of our ancestors combined have ever seen. So for young men to resist that, it's really hard. Like I feel for them. Like they need support. I feel for them. I couldn't have resisted that when I was their age. I'm glad that I'm glad that I was jerking off before AI was a thing. I'm glad I've grown out of that. But it also means that they're going to be warriors. Like they're going to be borderline saints, and they do. There's a whole no fap thing, and I see these guys at the gym, and I see them in church. So I don't think we should be too depressed yet. And as I say, the culture's turned. The women are just waiting to follow them. The women always follow the men, and at the moment, the really intelligent people and the really strong people and all the people having kids have already turned. So I feel like the Christian saying, "In the end, we win." That's already becoming apparent.
But hang on a second. The view I'm going to take, Mark, is that actually everything's power, and white men have had the power for a very, very long time. So the fact that there's a redress now in the media, and the fact that yes, the institutions are captured, but for good reasons.
Yeah. Two wrongs make a right. Is that what we learned when we were young? No.
It's
No,
payback time, Whitey.
okay. I mean, first of all, it's just insulting to all the sort of working class white men to be told they have power when actually they're the only ones you can legally actively discriminate against in the workplace and university places, when they're actually doing far worse than young women, for example, in university places or whatever. Suicide rates, just so many actual hard measures. If people want the facts, they should follow the Tin Men. It's a wonderful Instagram account who has all the facts and figures and numbers. So it's not just my opinion. And like, if you look at those, you'd be hard pressed to say that, men, particularly young white men, have privilege and are somehow, this power needs to be addressed. So, I appreciate you playing devil's advocate, but you're wrong.
No, Mark, I've been cosplaying a right winger. I'm now revealing my true faith.
There's blue hair underneath there. We're gonna take the mask off.
Earrings off.
Why do you think I've got such good skin? You know, it's what I get up to at the weekend. You know, like I kind of, when I hear, for example, I saw a social experiment. I think it was a Channel 4 program. They said they lined up a group of school kids. It was a bit horrible actually watching it, to be honest. But they said, you know, you're all going to start a race, but you're going to start this race we're going to ask you questions. And the question was, take a step forward if you've ever been the only person of your race in the room. And, you know, black and Asian people then step forward, white people stay behind. And they basically asked a series of very leading questions to get to the point where, well, I've never been the only person in the room with my skin color, so maybe I do have some advantages I haven't thought of.
Yeah, I mean, you could take that either way, right? Like I've been the only person of my race in Japan and Ethiopia and many of the places I've traveled, and sometimes it's been an advantage, sometimes it's been a disadvantage. So the basic problem with the privilege narrative is threefold. One is who gets to say what's a privilege and what isn't, right? So, for example, I don't know, example, I think it was Peterson or someone else used is the princes. So, like, if you take the young princes in the UK, their mother died when they were very young. Well, is there a word for the privilege? My mother didn't die. She hasn't died yet. I've been very lucky to have a good mother who raised me to manhood. They didn't have that privilege. So are they privileged? Well, they're certainly privileged financially, but how much money is a mother worth? So that comes us to our next problem, right? Like the first problem is who gets to say, that is the ultimate power. Who gets to say what is power? That's a power in itself, and there's no way to determine that. Second one is how do we measure them against each other? Like, would you rather be black or poor? Right? Like, and there's so many types of layers of privilege. Like I had an alcoholic dad, right? There's no word for not having an alcoholic dad. But I tell you what, it sucks as a kid if you live in a little village and your dad's coming out being dragged home drunk. So the way in which I suffered was not obvious compared to, say, my black mate who did get racially discriminated against. And that's not nothing. So that's in there somewhere, right? Third one here is it's situational. So I'll give you, I dance as well as do martial arts. I love all movement stuff. And I went to a dance school in London and I was the only straight man in there. And I was actively discriminated against every day. There was a girl who had a t-shirt that said, replace all men with machines. And I thought, okay, try reversing that, you know, because she worked in tech where she was discriminated against. Right. But she wore that t-shirt to dance. And I'm the only guy there feeling really uncomfortable. The brochures all got women on. They talk about female stuff all the time. You know, in the class, they say, move from your bra strap. And I'm like, I don't have one. So like in that environment, situationally, you know, the discrimination's against me and, you know, horrible place. Yeah. So in that situation, I wasn't an advantage. So this is very, and there are multiple ways women are advantaged, say, compared to men, or white people are disadvantaged compared to black people. I'm so bored of having this conversation. Like 5 years ago, maybe, right? But I sort of go, there's also an opportunity cost. While we're having this conversation, somebody else is going to Mars, right? Like there's real shit we need to talk about. It's just annoying and insulting at this point.
So, Mark, you've been to conflict zones. You've been to Ukraine, Sierra Leone. We talked about the last time we spoke. That's basically, you know, like healing nation, bringing people together, civil war in the case of Sierra Leone. You talked about the male-female divide, females left, males right, leaning, young, maybe middle-aged. I'm not sure where old people are. How do you bring communities back together? Because it does feel like the UK is a pressure cooker.
Yeah. I mean, I think, first of all, we have to say there's been a sort of gaslighting done, to overuse another term, which is the UK doesn't have a culture, but if you do, it has some original sin. I think we have to acknowledge those two things are just lies. So one is to say, no, there is a British culture, even if it's sometimes hard to define. And there's been a certain amount of, you know, my family are Irish migrants, right? So there's been a certain amount of fresh water coming in, but nothing like the level since the 90s. You know, there's always been a few Huguenots and a bit of this and a bit of that, but there has been a relatively consistent culture for 1,000 years. That's not nothing. The other thing, and I could use other examples like Irish or German or whatever, but I'll just stay with the British. The British should be proud. British ended slavery. The British had Shakespeare. The British had the Beatles. The British have done so much good in the world that people want to move from the third world to Anglo countries because they're so good. Like, migrants are not idiots. They want to move to these places because they're brilliant. Like, we should be absolutely cultural chauvinists. We should say, this is a superior culture. Like, I spent time in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, they think that, I'll say, how can I put this for the YouTube? Uh, Violating boys is normal and fine in Afghanistan. Okay. I disagree with that as a cultural norm. I think that's bad. Yeah. I think our culture is superior to theirs in that regard and many others. So that's the first thing we need to do is reclaim a cultural pride, not let anyone lie about our history, and reclaim the right to have borders. I mean, psychological well-being is almost defined. And you'll see this like, hashtag boundaries. Like all the young liberals love boundaries. They're being forced to assert individual boundaries because they have no cultural boundaries. Like Chesterton's fences have all been smashed down and they have no cultural boundaries left. So they have to individually have boundaries.
So this brings me to the point about boundaries. So one of the ideas which has got us to where we are is that no borders. Is that just an extrapolation of I don't have any, for example, parent and has no boundaries with the child because that would be traumatizing the kid?
Yeah. Well,
that's something you come across.
I mean, it's a Christian heresy. So many things are. I mean, there's various historians who have pointed this out that are better educated than me. But that Jesus's message was like, hey, I get it. You're Jewish. We're ethnocentric. Liberalism is just shit Christianity. Yeah. So good Christianity says, yeah, you have a tribe, you have a people. Like in the church I go to, there's a Ljubljana flag, a Slovenian flag, and a universal Catholic flag. So we're all made in the image of God. We're all one family, but it's okay that within that family, there's a household. In this case, it's a Slovenian household. So that's a sort of nested hierarchy that leads to universality. And, obviously Jesus's message was one of tolerance and openness, but it was also one of whipping people out of the temple. He said, don't throw the first stone, but he didn't say get an OnlyFans account. He said go and sin no more afterwards, right? So it's like he was also like that was just a norm because the Jewish boundaries, and they still are, like if you go around Orthodox Jews, they're tough boundaries. They have a strong sense of us and boundaries, and that's beautiful. And as far as it is, it can be limited and racist, but it's still it's still helpful. And the misunderstanding of Jesus's message taken out of a spiritual context is essentially this overly yin, overly liberal. It's all yes and not enough no. And that's always been the satanic message. You can think of this metaphorically or literally, is nobody will tell me what to do. And this is where we can blame the boomers again in the 60s, this idea of like, I don't want the man isn't telling me what to do. I'll do what I want. It's a very immature version of freedom, as opposed to the version of freedom, which is like, I'm free to not look at porn on my phone because I've overcome that and I don't go near it. Right? Like I'm free to actually make a decision, Plato would say, from my sort of best self. Freud too, actually. That I'm not driven by, I'm not pushed around by my most base desires or the most base desires of consumer culture. I can actually make good decisions about how I want to live with my sexuality or money or whatever. So yeah, I think a lot of it, the unboundaried life looks like heaven, but is hell.
You travel around the world. You've been to these war zones. You've been to Ukraine multiple times. You've got your charity there. How does the UK look like to these countries when you talk to people? What do they first tell you about the UK?
They're laughing at us. They think we're an absolute joke. I mean, first of all, people respect British heritage and history and literature. There's much they respect in our history. But I've worked a lot in Russia before the war, Ukraine, Poland. I live in Slovenia now. And they think we're bizarre. I was married to a Ukrainian previously, right? And I said, I'm pretty masculine guy. She said, oh, no. In UK, masculine, yes, UK 8, Ukraine 6, and I was, so we're like comically camp compared to these guys. The average Polish guy understands borders and violation. They understand the evils of the left as well as the right because of the Soviets, right? So I think they think we're silly. They think we're bizarre, and they wouldn't even believe me. I remember trying to explain the trans thing to some of my Russian colleagues who were pretty liberal Russians. I supported gay rights in Russia. I took a risk on that, But I tried to explain like some of the things that were going on in the UK, and they literally wouldn't believe me. They thought I was like, it was too silly to be true. So yeah, I think that's what's going on. And the jokes now they're making around sort of the violation of mass migration are also like I live in the former Yugoslavia, right? There was a civil war here in the not long ago in the 90s, and over much smaller differences than we now have in London. Like Croatians, Serbians, Bosnians, their language is very similar. Genetically, they're very similar, though they would deny it. They are on genetics tests. They have a different religion. Okay, they have a different creed, but they're not as different as Somalis and Afghanis from British people or French people. And there was absolute mayhem here. And the only reason Slovenia, where I live now, didn't suffer was because they were 95% Slovenian. They were a homogenous nation. And that, of course, is the norm in human history to have a family, to have a, you know, that's all a nation is, an extended family, right? It's absolutely the norm. And unfortunately, modern psychologists have pathologized it following on from this. In trauma, they call it hypervigilance. So hypervigilance is, for example, because I've been around a lot of war zones, I hear the thunder going on outside, and I'm like a little bit like hypervigilant. Not too much, but just, you know, I've treated it mostly, but a little bit there. If a man hurts a woman, she may become hypervigilant and become a lesbian, for example, right? Like that is a thing, even if people deny it. Culturally, we've become hypervigilant about nationalism since World War One and World War Two, and hypervigilant about religion since the 30 Years' War.
We travel around the UK for our award-winning documentary "Should Brits Come Home," which I know you've watched the first 2 minutes of because I basically
very cool. Well done. Yeah,
they were good. The first 2 minutes were great, which I've heard said to me before in the past. And one of the kind of really disturbing things we got was a professor saying that he thinks the UK is on a path to civil war. Now, you've just literally said that there are more divisions in the UK now than in countries that have had civil wars.
Yes, absolutely.
So
far more.
Is that if nothing changes, that's the inevitable path?
Let me tread carefully because I'd like to be able to visit my mother again in the UK. So I've been around a lot of civil wars in various countries, and they are very bad. And anyone who's cheering this on should look at more history and more current affairs because civil wars are a nightmare. Like there's a film called Civil War about a supposed civil war in America, a famous Hollywood movie a couple of years back. I went to see it with my fiance. She also used to work in war zones. We're trauma bonded. And we both laughed at it and said, this is so light compared to how bad a civil war actually is. This is nowhere near atrocious enough. The stories I've heard from Ukraine, not a civil war, but it's a cousin war, though again, they wouldn't admit it, is just awful, like awful to a way that you wouldn't sleep for a week if I told you now, and I won't reveal them on the podcast, right? So I think we should be very, very cautious of it. And if we look at history, people like David Betts have been on various podcasts talking about this. There is a pattern there that we should be very, very wary of. The other thing is I've done various videos on this, and I've seen Betts's videos on trigonometry and stuff. And the most common comment now is something like this: I used to worry there'd be a civil war. Now I worry there won't be one. That's the most common. Now, I don't share that sentiment, but I understand it. Yeah. And I think essentially as you have the more diverse, in the worst sense of the word, a population becomes, also the more authoritarian the government has to become to stop that civil war. So I think we're also seeing that. We're also seeing the crackdown on the native population, who are rightly pissed. They have been violated. There's no democratic remit for what happened. No one asked them. Every vote was a vote against it. Brexit was a vote against it, and people were betrayed by the Conservative Party. And there are people like Rupert Lowe who are now sort of standing up and speaking the truth about this. So yeah, I see hope, and maybe we can pull back from the edge, but we are on an edge.
What mistakes are the right making then? We talked a lot about the left. What are the kind of psychological tricks that the right are playing on themselves in this?
Being too good looking, too well dressed, and too buff from going to the gym and having too much good sex. No. So the right tends to sometimes lose understanding of a circumstance. Think of it like this. Life is a game. What's the game? The left thinks it's roulette. So they think everything's a game of chance. Therefore, if someone wins, it's unfair. Okay. Or they think the game is rigged. The casino's rigged. Roulette rigged by the casino. The right, that's a mistake because there's skill and there's talent and there's merit, right? Now, they're not totally wrong though, because for example, I didn't go to a school where lots of people went to Oxford or whatever, right? So the right, they tend to make the mistake of saying that life is chess. It's all a matter of skill. And it's not. It's more like poker. It's not as skillful and merit-based as chess, which is 100% merit, right? It's more like poker where you get dealt a hand and then your skill is how you play that hand. And I think when they don't understand that, they're not very compassionate. And I think a really good solution for a good life personally and culturally is what I call conscious, compassionate conservatism. So it has to be conscious because the other mistake conservatives makes is implicit. They can't tell you why family and religion and nationalism is a good thing. It's just like who is the Roger Scruton talked about the sort of moral instinct of conservatism. The beautiful thing now is it's been articulated, right? We've had to articulate it because the insanity on the other side has been so extreme. So we can make it conscious, not unconscious, compassionate. So we understand that some people have shitty backgrounds. You know, some people do have real trauma, not just I couldn't get a oat milk for my latte in East London trauma, you know, like real trauma. And conservative in the sense that we bring back healthy boundaries. So if you can, the mistake that conservatives make is not being conscious and not being compassionate in their conservatism. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. You took the words out of my mouth. Roger Scruton, he articulated what is extremely difficult to articulate.
It's a moral instinct, right? For people like us, we just like it stuff. Yeah.
But the left, they still believe in this lump of labor fallacy, this zero-sum game. And I don't understand why that is not thrown out the window as it should be forever. Go no further than, for example, Professor Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, who looks all sorts of measures of human well-being, charts them all, and everything just goes through the roof since the Enlightenment, which started in Britain and Scotland.
Yeah, Pinker,
in the
I would
18th
have some
century.
doubts about, but I mean, it's the left views is unscientific. I mean, we can they believe in the blank
There's no
slate.
denying the fact, though, that the well-being is not a zero-sum game. It has gone through the roof, and make poverty history is a thing coming globally thanks to the Enlightenment values of free markets starting properly, law and order, level playing field from good courts in the 18th century.
Yes, and we've now reached the limit of that. So what Pinker mostly points to is material well-being, but man doesn't live off bread alone. So we've got more bread now. Absolutely. We've got I've been in starving countries in Africa. That is not a small thing. Also, I can walk down the street in Ljubljana without getting mugged any time at night. You know, the law and order is amazing. We are this close to heaven in the West, and we're not there, but we're this close and we don't really realize it. That is beautiful. But what we've sacrificed for that material success is a lack of spiritual success. So we are the most mentally ill, suicidal, and drug addicted culture in human history. And you're right, but you need to add to that material success. Okay, how do we now have the psychological success they had in, say, Christendom, you know, in the Middle Ages, for example? Like we need to combine those two things together. And that's the next step that we're getting to now. And if we don't do it, we become extinct. So it's absolutely necessary for our survival.
I'm wondering if I've been watching this and I've made it through your fascist far right agitation.
Deeply far right, yeah.
You horrible Nazi. If I've managed to make it through, and let's say I'm from the left, and there's a certain cost to me saying, "Oh my God, I think I've got my whole life choices wrong," and it's so big that probably there's a bigger incentive just to say, "Oh, he's just a far right Nazi. No, I'm not going to listen to him." How do is there a feeling I feel where I think, is there something in this? And where do I pull on the string, or do I just go, oh, he's a Nazi?
Okay, there's the 10% and the 80%. The 10%, the people who allowed their teenage daughters to cut their breasts off, they're too far gone. After 5 abortions, they're too far gone. They're too committed because no woman is going to say I killed 5 babies and I'm a murderer. They can't do it. It's too much to ask once you've transed your kid or whatever it is, right? You've been an OnlyFans person for years and years and years. Whatever. It's too much. So that 10%, there's no way we're getting them. Okay. The other 80%, the good news is that Western culture quite uniquely values truth. And people still like Chernobyl, you know, there's a cost to lies. They understand there's a cost to lies, and that cost is getting higher and higher and higher. And I think people don't like to live by lies. They really, to use another phrase, they really don't like to live by lies. The other thing is we've got to be appealing to them. Like I had a leftist philosopher around for lunch yesterday. I tried to be civil. I fed him steak, not vegan food. Okay, he loved the steak. I tried to listen, even though it's hard when he was spouting absolute bullshit. I said, listen, come over to our side. We've got, hot women who don't hate you, and you can come to the gym, and we love ourselves and our countries, and like we're polite, and that's how my cousin got me, man. When I was more liberal, he was just nice, and like his girlfriend was cool, and it's like we've got girls in sundresses, and it's like we've like this is a good team to be on. Like the left, or they're just infighting and screaming at each other and accusing each other of racism based on nothing. It's a better time over here, guys. So yeah, come on over.
We've just had the Unite the Right rally march. Some people call it hate march in the UK.
Hate. There's
Is
another
that
word the left got. Yeah.
yes, hate. Is that a healthy outlet of frustration, or is it a manifestation of hate?
Okay, so I don't know about that particular march. It wasn't there, so I can't comment. What I do think is that having a healthy sense of one's tribe is good. The idea that any kind of love of one's people is bad is profoundly unnatural. I mean, we have an in-group bias just genetically, as far as I can tell. Yes, it has limits. The Germans took it a bit far, naughty Germans. Okay, but there is a healthy sense of loving one's people, healthy sense of boundaries, and that's love. Conservatism comes from loving your people. It doesn't come from hating. Like I love Japanese culture. Like I have a Slavic icon on here, right? I love this like art from another country. I've studied Japanese calligraphy and martial arts. It's wonderful to love other countries, but not at the expense of being oikophobic, to use Benedict Beckeld's term. Yeah, like to hate oneself. And also this idea of like hate. Anyone who disagrees with me is hate. We need to bring back hate. We need to hate the sin, not the sinner, in Christian terms. We need to hate that which is anti-life, if we just look at it in those terms. Hate just means having strong feelings against something that's bad. It's okay. Now, we shouldn't be genocidal, but that doesn't mean we should love things that are worthy of hate. I mean, if you love something, you hate something else. These are two sides. The word hate is mentioned in the Bible many times if you're Christian. Now, the Buddhists would say we definitely need to be careful with anger because it can be unwise. And I think, the sort of working class shouting and smashing things up, that's being antagonized by the media. It's not strategic. But what we're seeing now is more the middle class who are more strategic and are less likely to just riot and burn cars and stuff like that are getting involved. People like the Lotus Eaters, for example, some really good people there. Yeah, really pushing back on this idea of anyone who disagrees with me is a Nazi, and anyone who doesn't disagree with me is full of hate in inverted commas.
Well, Mark Walsh, I have done my best to educate you out of your place of male white privilege, but for whatever reason, you haven't seen the light. But I'm going to not pray for you because praying would be bad, but I'm going to cross my fingers that one day you will see the truth. But either way, you're
postmodern. You don't believe in truth, and you don't believe in goodness. So you're really fucked because you can't say what I'm saying is not true because you don't believe in truth, and you can't say what I'm saying is bad because you don't believe in morality. So you're really screwed.
No, it's okay because I've got you recorded, and I'm going to stop you from ever speaking again. So
it's okay. I live in the Balkans. People here aren't too worried about it. Yeah, I mean, unless you're doing a cheeky genocide against your neighbors, they don't even consider it racism here. So it's all fine.
Very good. Well, maybe that's a subject for a future episode as the UK progresses on its wild ways. Mark, thank you very much for joining us on Custom and Reason. I think it's been an interesting episode, wouldn't you say, Guy?
A whirlwind tour. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I hope I didn't get you guys cancelled as well. But I mean, you're in Poland, right? So it should be fine. Can I say where people can find me if they're
absolutely?
So I do workshops on the meaning of life where we look at this stuff we contemplate death, and it's fun and intense and lots of bad jokes, not for the easily offended. They could go to embodimentunlimited.com. I train coaches there. I have a very offensive Instagram account, which is Walsh, my name, Mark Walsh reversed. And I've got a book for young men called How to Become Human, which is basically if you want to like radicalize any young guys. It's possibly illegal, the book, I'm not sure, but it's good for radicalizing young men. So there's a few resources for people.
What can I say? I'm looking forward to reading it. Mark, thank you very much.
Total pleasure, gentlemen.